He was still not ready to give up the fight, and commandeering 3 ships, made a daring dash past Brutus's blockade during a storm. Brutus's ships pursued, catching 2, but the one Ahenobarbus was on slipped away in the storm. He would live. To fight another day, Caesar left the 18th and 19th legions to garrison the city, while he marched to Italy with the 5th, 7th, and 10th to rejoin his main army. In 7 months, Caesar had chased Pompey from Italy, secured his western flank, disbanded 5 of Pompey's legions, and absorbed a further 4 so far. The war was going very much in Caesar's favor, but this was still just the start. Ahenobarbus had managed to escape to Greece to rejoin Pompey, and was soon followed by Varro, Afranius, and Petreius, despite the latter two's oath to Caesar. Pompey was amassing a vast army in Greece, and he still held the lucrative territories in the east, as well as the important grain hub of North Africa. The war in the west might have been over for now, but the war for the rest of the Roman world was about to begin. While Caesar was on his way to confront Pompey's legions in Spain, his legates were fighting the civil war in the Mediterranean and African theater. Before Caesar even reached Spain, Valerius had taken Sardinia with the 16th legion, and Curio had claimed Sicily with the 15th and 17th together around the end of April to early May of 49 BC. They combined their forces in Sicily, along with the 20th legion from Italy, making a total of 4 legions and about 1,500 cavalry, and began preparing to invade North Africa. Alongside Sardinia and Sicily, North Africa, specifically modern Tunis, was one of the biggest suppliers of grain feeding the Roman Republic at the time. Taking North Africa would, therefore, give Caesar control of all the major grain centers, ensuring he could supply his armies throughout the war, and robbing Pompey of any opportunity to starve him out of Italy. Command of this invasion was assigned to Curio, who was a skilled politician but lacked military command experience. He had been crucial to Caesar in the Senate. However, and this was his reward, to compensate for his lack of experience, he was assigned a body of talented legates, including Rubulus, a legate who had served with Caesar in Gaul and fought with distinction at Alesia. The legions Curio commanded were largely raw, all having been raised just a few months earlier while Caesar was pushing south through Italy. However, Caesar knew that Pompey's best troops were in Spain and the east, and so any Pompeian troops in Africa would be equally raw. It was thought that, with 4 legions, Curio had enough men and talented advisors to invade successfully. However, Curio did not want to invade Africa without first hearing news from Spain, just in case his men would be needed to support Caesar. So for now, he remained in Sicily. Africa was under the control of the Pompeian Publius Attius Varus. Varus had previously been propraetor of the province and was dismayed to find it woefully unprepared for war. With only 1 legion present in Hadrumetum, he immediately took control and strengthened the province, raising another 2 legions and encamping them outside Utica. Furthermore, he requested the aid of the nearby client king, Juba of Numidia. Juba was an old ally of Pompey, who owed his kingship to Pompey's earlier campaign and had a personal hatred of Caesar and Curio, as both had insulted him in the past. He readily agreed to side with the Pompeians and would prove to be a crucial ally for Varus. It wasn't until August, after receiving word of Caesar's victory in Spain, that Curio began his crossing into Africa. Curio did not think much of his opponents, disdaining both Varus and Juba, and so instead of bringing his full force across, he only brought 2 legions, likely the 15th and 16th, and 500 cavalry, along with a sizable navy landing at Ancularia. Between Utica and Hadrumetum, Curio decided to engage the larger force first, and so began his march to Utica, reaching the river Bagradas 2 days later. Here, he left Rubulus in charge of the legions while he took the cavalry ahead to scout the Castra Cornelia, an old Roman fort on a small elevated peninsula that was left over from the Punic Wars. This camp was just 5 kilometers from Utica, and from the higher ground, Curio reconnoitered Varus's camp. The Pompeian camp was in a strong position, using the walls of Utica as part of its defenses on one side, and the outdoor amphitheater of Utica blocking another, making any approach to the camp narrow and difficult. When observing the town, Curio saw a large number of supplies being brought into the city on the roads from the local populace seeking refuge, looking to hamper Varus's supplies and take some for himself. Curio sent his cavalry to attack them. Varus was quick to react, though, and sent his own force of 600 Numidian horsemen and 400 Numidian infantry to defend him. The Numidian cavalry, which had raced ahead of the infantry, clashed with the Roman horse first, but the Numidians were lightly armed and best accustomed to skirmishing rather than melee fighting. Curio's men were able to inflict significant casualties in the fight, forcing the Numidian cavalry to flee back to the town and camp, quickly followed by the infantry. Traders and their goods were seized by Curio and taken back to the Castra Cornelia, which he planned to use as his main base for the invasion. Meanwhile, Curio's navy had moved into position outside the port of Utica, which harbored possibly as many as 200 merchant ships with no military ships for protection. Curio sent a proclamation declaring that any merchant ship that did not transfer their supplies to the Castra Cornelia would be treated as an enemy and boarded by his navy. With no naval protection, the merchants saw little choice and sailed their goods to the Castra Cornelia, providing the Caesarians with a further abundance of supplies. Curio's campaign was off to a good start, leaving a small force in the Castra Cornelia to guard the supplies. He returned to his troops at the Bagradas with news of his achievements, where they recognized him as Imperator. Bolstered by this success, the next day he moved his army to go on the offensive, aiming to encamp just outside the town of Utica, displaying a similar kind of aggression to Caesar. While this camp was being constructed, Curio received word from the pickets that a large Numidian force was approaching. Curio had failed to scout the area properly and was surprised by this sudden new force. Quickly, he ordered his men to abandon the construction of the camp and form battle lines, while he sent his cavalry to engage the Numidians in a delaying action. The Numidians did not march in a tight formation, and so were vulnerable to cavalry charges. As soon as Curio's cavalry made contact, the Numidian cavalry fled into Utica, followed swiftly by the infantry. The Roman cavalry harassed the Numidian infantry, inflicting some casualties, but the bulk of the Numidian force successfully made it into the camp. Caesar describes the Numidians as having been routed, but it seems more likely that this was a tactical withdrawal. The Numidians likely had not been seeking an engagement in the first place and prioritized combining with Varus's forces rather than being drawn into a pitched battle. Though Curio had, so far, been largely successful, the following day, 2 of his centurions and 22 of their men defected to Varus. They told Varus that Curio's army did not have faith in him, and that Varus would be able to win them over to his side. Their motivation for doing this is not known. Curio had performed well, so far aside from poor scouting, and had apparently been hailed as Imperator. So it is unlikely that Curio's men lacked confidence in him as portrayed. The more likely reason is that Curio's men were still effectively raw recruits. They had not fought a pitched battle before, and some of the officers in Varus's army had trained and led Curio's men at Corfinium. It is likely, therefore, that the men were motivated more out of fear or an unwillingness to fight former comrades than dissatisfaction with Curio. Nevertheless, the next day, Varus marched his force out of camp, Curio following suit, an officer in Varus's army. Sextus Varus, who had been one of the officers at Corfinium, appealed to Curio's men. He reminded them that they had previously sworn oaths to Pompey, Aenobarbus, and to himself, and that they should not fight the men they trained with and had been prepared to fight alongside. Though Curio's army showed little reaction, Varus withdrew his force back into camp, confident that, given time, this appeal would strike a chord with Curio's men. Though the message had been received in silence at first, when Curio's legions were back in camp, the men began to talk amongst themselves. Oaths held a strong religious connotation, and they were not broken easily. The more the men talked, the more they began to fear that they had made a mistake by switching their allegiance from Pompey to Caesar. Rumors likely exaggerated the number of men who were of this mindset, though some certainly were. And Curio was soon worried that his whole army was on the brink of mutiny. Curio gathered his officers and sought advice on how to address the situation. The officers suggested two options. Firstly, that they attack the Pompeian camp immediately, thinking that keeping the men busy would be best rather than allowing any rumors to circulate. Or secondly, to withdraw back to the Castra Cornelia to try to calm the men there. Curio was not convinced of either option. He saw an all-out attack on the camp as foolhardy and a retreat as a show of cowardice. Furthermore, he believed the number of men who were genuinely feeling disloyal had been overplayed. As such, he gathered the soldiers and addressed them. He gave a rousing speech, pointing out that Ahenobarbus had surrendered at Corfinium, voiding any oaths the men had made to him, and that their oaths to Caesar now took precedence. He espoused the achievements of Caesar in Spain, saying that they were on the winning side, so why join the losing one? Finally, he listed his own achievements in Africa so far, and that they had hailed him as Imperator. The men were moved by the speech and acclaimed Curio, putting to rest any ideas of mutiny. It is possible that not many men felt that way in the first place, but either way, Curio was continuing to show himself as a man with leadership potential. With a simple speech, he had regained full control of the army without needing to resort to harsh discipline or excessive time wasting. Determined to draw Varus into a pitched battle, Curio marched his men out of camp the following day. Varus followed suit, the two armies facing off with each other across a large ditch. The ditch was not particularly deep, only around 25 meters, but its sides were steep and would present a disadvantage to any trying to scramble up. Varus made the first move, sending his Numidian cavalry from the left flank, supported by light infantry, to flank Curio's force. Curio countered by sending two cohorts of the 16th, along with all his cavalry. The Numidian cavalry charged the Roman legionaries. But lightly armed, they were easily repulsed and routed. The light infantry was left exposed and surrounded by Curio's heavy infantry and cavalry, were slaughtered. Rubulus urged Curio to capitalize on this success and charge Varus's force. To instigate a mass rout, Curio heeded the advice and led his men across the ditch. But even as they were scaling the other side, Varus's force, seeing that Curio now had a cavalry advantage and could easily outflank them, had begun to flee the battlefield. They did not retreat in good order, and Varus himself was wounded and almost killed in the retreat, as his army tried to push through the narrow pass to their camp. They became caught in a bottleneck, and many were slain by Curio's pursuing force. Indeed, more of Varus's men died here than in the battle, however. When Varus's men had made the safety of the camp, Curio did not push any further, not having the equipment needed to besiege the camp. Caesar gives Curio's casualties as being just one man. This is surely not accurate, but it is likely that his casualties were minimal, while Varus had lost almost 600 dead and 1,000 wounded. This battle might seem unbelievable in how quickly Varus's men broke, but there are a few points to consider. Firstly, Varus misused his Numidian cavalry. The Numidians were light cavalry and skilled skirmishers, but due to their light arms and armor, were not equipped for melee fighting against heavy cavalry and infantry. Secondly, Varus's whole army had only recently been levied less than 6 months ago. Likely, very few of his men had any military experience, which explains why they were so quick to rout. Compare, for instance, the actions of Caesar's legions in Spain who, when cut off from the army and at risk of being surrounded, retreated in order to high ground and formed a defensive square. That is the difference between veterans and raw recruits. Under the cover of darkness, Varus moved what was left of his force into the city of Utica, leaving just a small detachment of men, trumpeters, and tents in the camp to give the illusion it was still garrisoned. Curio was quick to discover the ploy and began the creation of earthworks around Utica to besiege the city. Initially, the citizens of Utica appealed to Varus to surrender, not wanting to go through the grueling experience of a siege. However, a messenger arrived in Utica with information that Juba, king of Numidia, was on his way and nearby to support Varus. It is not known how large Juba's army was, aside from 60 elephants, but given that this was the royal army, it surely numbered in the tens of thousands. With these reinforcements on the way, Varus soothed the citizens' concerns, confident that he would be able to defeat Curio. Curio soon discovered the same information. Initially, he did not believe the reports, confident that he was on the brink of victory, and continued the siege. More reports came in, however, verifying the information and saying that Juba was now just 36 kilometers away. Upon learning this, Curio abandoned his plans of besieging Utica. Withdrawing to the Castra Cornelia instead, he began further fortifying the fort and sent word to Sicily to send over the 2 legions and all the cavalry left in Sicily. This was a good plan. The Castra Cornelia could be easily defended, and with access to the sea, Curio could maintain a supply line and safely await reinforcements. Juba was a cunning opponent, though. He sent men from Utica under the guise of deserters to Curio, saying that Juba had had to redirect his force to suppress a rebellion, and that the Numidian force was only a small force commanded by his lieutenant Sabura. Curio, still riding the wave of his previous victories and keen to prove himself, believed these reports and sought to crush the Numidians in a pitched battle. Abandoning his defensive position around 3 a.m., he marched his force to the Bagradas to confront them, leaving 5 cohorts in the Castra Cornelia. Having learned his lesson previously, Curio sent his cavalry ahead of his legions as a scouting party, and they quickly discovered Sabara's own advanced units. Curio's cavalry fell upon the Numidians, who, taken by surprise and with no encampment, suffered heavy casualties before retreating back to Sabara's main force. However, instead of staying to hold the area or scouting further ahead, Curio's cavalry headed back to Curio's main force with a few prisoners to tell him of their success. Curio had already marched 10 kilometers from the Castra Cornelia when his cavalry returned. He questioned the prisoners as to who their commander was, and they replied that Sabura was, confirming in Curio's mind that he was only facing a small portion of the Numidian army. Determined, Curio pushed his men to march on. In the meantime, however, Sabura had sent word to Juba about the night battle, and in response, Juba had sent ahead 2,000 Spanish and Gallic cavalry, part of his personal guard, and his best infantry to bolster Sabura's army. While Juba continued his advance with the main force, Sabura kept withdrawing his force, feigning retreats and pulling the Romans after him. Curio was being lured into a trap. Curio's army had now marched almost 28 kilometers since breaking camp, and his men were exhausted from the early start. They now found themselves on a large, flat open plain. This was what Sabura had been waiting for. He lined up his infantry for battle, but kept them a fair distance from the Roman force, enough to be a threat, but far enough away to not be caught by the Romans, and left most of the fighting to his cavalry. The previous engagements had already depleted Curio's cavalry, and still more had paused to rest and water their horses, leaving Curio with just 200 horsemen when the forces engaged, and the Numidians used this to their advantage. Their heavier Gallic and Spanish cavalry would charge the Roman flanks and rear, while the lighter Numidian cavalry skirmished and harassed them. Curio tried to use his cavalry to chase away the enemy charges, but they were too tired to pursue, and Sabura's men would simply withdraw and then strike in another place. When the Numidians could draw a cohort into breaking ranks and charging, the cohort would find itself utterly surrounded by horsemen and cut down. Fighting in such a manner and on such open and flat terrain was ideal for the Numidians. By this point, the whole of Curio's army was surrounded by Sabura's force, and more of Juba's men were trickling in, providing a constant supply of fresh reinforcements against the exhausted Romans. Desperately, Curio ordered some of his men to take the legion's standards and to fight their way out of the encirclement to some nearby hills. The Numidians allowed them to break through the ring at first, but soon quickly surrounded them and cut them down to a man. The battle was a disaster. Curio's army had lost all hope. Some men broke down and cried to the gods or their mothers. Others simply abandoned their weapons and waited to die. Gnaeus Domitius, the prefect of horse, gathered what little cavalry was left around Curio and urged him to try to save himself and retreat to the Castra Cornelia. Curio replied that he would never be able to face Caesar after such a disaster. He died fighting alongside his men. Both the 5th, 10th, and 16th legions were completely destroyed, around 11,000 men. The Roman cavalry that had been watering their horses had watched the destruction from a distance and raced back to the Castra Cornelia to inform the 5 cohorts and the quaestor left in charge, Marcius Rufus, of the disaster. He tried to organize an evacuation by sea back to Sicily of the men left. But panic had already taken over, as rumors spread that Varus might be closing in for the kill. Men pushed past one another to scramble onto the ships, and some became so overburdened that they sank. The captains of the ships grew equally nervous, and in the end, only a few high-ranking officers, including Rubulus and Rufus, made it onto the ships before the captains set sail. The men that were left in the Castra Cornelia sent centurions to Varus and surrendered. The African campaign had been an unmitigated disaster, and Africa would remain in Pompeian hands. So far, Caesar himself had been largely successful in the civil war. His campaign in Spain had secured the West, as well as neutralizing some of Pompey's best legions, and he had been recruiting in Gaul and Italy, adding at least another 6 legions, however. His subordinates had not been as effective. Curio had lost 2 legions in North Africa, and his inability to take the province meant that supplies of grain in Rome would still be stretched. Around the same time, Gaius Antonius, the brother of Mark, Antony had lost 1.5 legions in Illyria to defection. To make matters worse, the veteran 9th, dismayed at their recent heavy casualties in Ilerda and lack of promised pay, had mutinied. Consular elections were due in Rome, and with both consuls having fled with Pompey, there was no one to oversee them, threatening the legitimacy of Caesar's cause. His first priority was the 9th Legion, as he wanted to stop mutiny from spreading to other legions in a similar position. Rushing to their camp, Caesar made an impassioned speech, pointing out that as a general renowned for his quick action, he could not be blamed for prolonging the war. He then chastised the men, saying that he had brought them fame and fortune, and they now repaid him by mutinying. The only suitable punishment for the legion would be decimation. The legion begged Caesar to reconsider, magnanimous as ever. Caesar only executed 12 of the ringleaders and brought the legion back into the fold. Caesar needed to maintain an air of legitimacy, but with no consuls in Rome, the elections could not be held. Lepidus, a praetor and close ally of Caesar, suggested Caesar be named dictator so that he could preside over the election. This was done, and Caesar was appointed consul, alongside another ally, Publius Cerules, with consular power. Caesar no longer needed the position of dictator and resigned after just 11 days. With these issues now handled, Caesar gathered his forces at Brundisium to finally confront Pompey. The latter was gathering a huge force from all corners of the Roman world and Thessalonica in total, Pompey had around 60,000 men, 9 full legions, approximately 4,000 archers and slingers, 7,000 cavalry, plus some auxiliaries. There were a further 2 legions en route from Syria, under the command of Metellus. Scipio. Pompey had spent time drilling and equipping his men, however. Only 4 of his legions were veterans. Cicero, who was with Pompey, described the bulk of the force as raw recruits. Mixed cultures and languages made organization difficult, trusting. In his numbers, though, Pompey marched to the west of Greece, preparing to create a defensive line down the coast. Caesar, in Brundisium, had gathered his 10 veteran legions, all under strength, due to years of campaigning and 2 newly recruited ones. However, he only had enough ships to move half his force across, and the Adriatic was being guarded by Pompey's vast navy under the command of Bibulus. With the path through Illyria being too mountainous for rapid movement, Caesar would have to find a way of crossing the sea. However, he did have one key advantage. The Roman calendar drifted over time and needed to be constantly updated by the Pontifex Maximus. Caesar had not performed this duty due to his constant campaigning, but he nonetheless knew the true date. It was late autumn. Bibulus was operating under the impression that it was winter, and had therefore kept his ships in port, confident that Caesar would not attempt a winter crossing. Ordering his men to leave slaves and baggage behind, Caesar set sail with 7 of his veteran legions. By the time Bibulus found out, Caesar and his men had already landed. Frustrated, Bibulus began a blockade, capturing and burning 30 of Caesar's ships as they returned to Brundisium, and preventing the rest from transporting the remainder of Caesar's army. Soon after his landing, Caesar was able to take both Oricum and Apollonia. He then sent Vibullius Rufus, a man Caesar had captured twice, once at Corfinium and once at Ilerda, to treat with Pompey. With his force divided, Caesar was possibly having second thoughts and was seeking a truce, offering the same terms as before. Nonetheless, Caesar continued marching his force toward Dyrrachium, an important supply center for the Pompeians. Caesar's sending Vibullius was a mistake, as the latter met Pompey and informed him of Caesar's location, army composition, and strategy, and Pompey would exploit it. He could not allow Dyrrachium to fall into Caesar's hands, and pushed his men on a forced march. Caesar still had 70 miles and 3 rivers to cross before reaching the city, and Pompey could still beat him there. The march took its toll on his more inexperienced men, with some of his Epirote allies deserting due to this push and their fear of Caesar. But he was ultimately successful, reaching Dyrrachium first. Labienus quickly restored morale by publicly swearing to follow Pompey at whatever cost, and the army encamped outside Dyrrachium, forcing Caesar to stop his advance. Withdrawing to a defensible position on the southern bank of the river Apsus, Pompey knew that Caesar had legitimacy as consul and could force his claim to be the rightful leader of Rome. So he had to defeat Caesar in the field. He moved his army south, encamping on the opposite side of the river to Caesar. Once again, though, Pompey proved indecisive. Caesar had just around 30,000 men compared to Pompey's 60,000, but Pompey did not trust his less experienced men to be able to defeat Caesar's veterans in a strong defensive position. A standoff continued for weeks. Caesar used this time to his advantage. Bibulus's navy had to constantly come ashore to resupply. Caesar dispatched small raiding parties to attack these men whenever they came ashore, forcing Bibulus to go further and further afield to get supplies. Bibulus knew he could not abandon his position, but after weeks of harassment, his men were resorting to drinking the dew collected on leather awnings. In desperation, he tried to parley with Caesar, offering to send peace envoys on his behalf to Pompey if Caesar would stop. Caesar countered by saying that he would want to send his own envoys, and that if Bibulus wanted to resupply unmolested, he would have to allow Caesar's transports to pass. All these talks had done was reveal to Caesar how effective his strategy was soon after. Old and now in increasingly poor health, Bibulus died, leaving the fleet leaderless. Antony had tried numerous times to break the blockade, but had been stopped every time. The Pompeians had kept him under significant pressure, even taking a small island in the harbor to try to trap Antony even further, however. Antony was a talented lieutenant, and quickly retook the island and kept his men on alert for any opportunity. It came in January 48 BC. Antony only had enough ships to transport the 3 remaining veteran legions and 1 newly recruited one. He made a dash for Caesar with these ships and was almost intercepted by Pompey's ships. Being forced to land at Nymphaeum, both Pompey and Caesar had to rush to Antony's position, Pompey, to cut him off, and Caesar to unite his forces. Pompey had a head start and a shorter route, Caesar having to march a considerable distance in order to be able to ford the river, and Pompey got to Antony's position first. He ordered his men not to light any fires and to lie in wait to try to ambush Antony as he moved to meet Caesar, however. Some locals sympathetic to the Caesarian cause alerted Antony, and he set up camp, sending a messenger to inform Caesar of his location. When Pompey found Antony encamped and Caesar closing in, he realized he was in danger of being attacked on 2 sides and withdrew to a safer position near Asparagum. With his full army now joined, Caesar started to be more aggressive, hearing that Scipio was now in Macedonia with his Syrian legions. Caesar sent 2 legions under Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus to cut him off. The Thessalians and Aetolians had sent envoys saying they would support Caesar in return for garrisons, and so Caesar sent the rookie 27th Legion under Cassius Longinus to Thessaly and Caldasius Sabinus with 5 cohorts to Aetolia to acquire more grain. Scipio did march his force toward Thessaly, threatening Longinus, but Calvinus and his legions were able to apply enough pressure to stop him uniting his force with Pompey. Meanwhile, one of Pompey's sons, Gnaeus, attacked Caesar's ships, destroying his whole navy in the area, leaving Caesar stranded in Greece and cut off from Italy. With his navy destroyed, Caesar knew he had to force an engagement with Pompey soon. He first attempted to do this at Asparagum, drawing up his army for battle, but Pompey on the high ground refused to commit. In order to force Pompey's hand, Caesar decided to march on Dyrrhachium. By threatening this crucial supply center, Pompey would be forced to respond, however. He did not want to reveal his strategy to Pompey, and so planned on taking a circuitous route to hide his intentions. He struck camp early in the morning in April. The plan worked. Initially, Pompey thought Caesar was withdrawing due to lack of supplies, and it was only after his scouts reported Caesar's movements that Pompey realized what Caesar was planning. He then gave chase. Caesar marched through the night, only giving his men a brief break, and was able to reach Dyrrhachium first, setting up his camp on high ground outside the city. Pompey arrived soon after, and encamped his force on high ground just south of Caesar's position. Pompey's army outnumbered Caesar's considerably, having sent part of his force to stall Scipio and part to southern Greece. Caesar had just 35,000 to 40,000 men and 3,000 cavalry. Pompey, on the other hand, had around 53,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Though Caesar's men were more experienced, Pompey did have the crucial advantage of having a better supply line. Using his navy, he could ship supplies from Dyrrhachium to his camp, whereas Caesar would be forced to live off the land and requisition food from local tribes. Even this would be difficult, as Pompey's forces had already plundered the area in the previous months. Noting the particularly hilly topography of the area, Caesar decided to fall back on one of his most favored tactics and fortify the hills around Pompey's position, encircling his enemy and cutting off their supplies. This would be a difficult task considering the size of the armies, but the natural topography simplified the task. When Pompey realized what Caesar was doing, he countered by constructing his own defenses. He ordered his men to fortify as many hills as possible, forcing Caesar to extend his own fortifications further and further. Stretching his army, frequent skirmishes broke out between the two forces, each harassing the other to try to slow their build. On one occasion, the 9th Legion, attempting to fortify a camp on a hilltop, came under intense masses of missile fire from the Pompeians on a nearby hill. Caesar, who was with the 9th at the time, ordered them to abandon the construction and retreat. Down the slope, commanding legionary engineers to place wattle screens to dig trenches behind to hinder the enemy from pursuing the legion. He then placed slingers in commanding positions to cover the withdrawal. The 9th was pursued by the Pompeian missiles and light infantry, who pushed the screens into the trenches to cross them. Caesar, fearing a rout, ordered Antony, commander of the 9th, to charge the Pompeians in a brilliant display of discipline. The 9th immediately turned, flung their javelins, and charged back up the slope. The Pompeians, being only lightly armed, retreated, and the 9th was able to withdraw in good order. Soon after, Caesar's defenses were complete. It was now late June. Due to his men's greater experience and discipline, he now had Pompey's force pinned against the sea. This was a great achievement. A smaller, less supplied force had never done this before in superior numbers. Though low on grain, Caesar did manage to level the playing field by having control of all the sources of fresh water in the area. Pompey was now forced to dig wells and rely on supplies from the sea. Furthermore, Caesar could now send his men further afield to gather supplies without fear of harassment. Pompey, however, was a skilled general and had his own strategies to keep Caesar under pressure. Sending missile units to harass Caesar's lines at night, targeting the light of their campfires, he also attempted to bring his cavalry into play, which, stuck behind the fortifications, had done little so far, boarding them onto ships. He sent them up the coast to Dyrrhachium. From here, they would be free from the confines of the fortifications and could forage without putting a burden on Pompey's supplies, as well as attack Caesar's line from the rear. Around the same time, in early July, Caesar received word that there were citizens of Dyrrhachium who were willing to be bribed and give him the town. Looking to capitalize, Caesar went to the town with a small armed escort, leaving Publius Cornelius Sylla in charge. However, when he reached the outskirts of the city, he was attacked by the Pompeian cavalry, who attempted to surround Caesar, and he only just managed to cut his way out with his men and survive the ambush. While Caesar was away from the main line, Pompey had also launched 3 simultaneous offensives on the fortifications. He ordered 4 legions to concentrate on a point in the center of the line, and 1 legion each to attack 2 other points in the line. The point the 4 legions were attacking was atop a hill and well fortified, but only defended by 500 men of the 6th Legion. The cohort was hard-pressed, thousands of missiles being fired into their position, but the men held on doggedly, confident that reinforcements would be arriving soon. They were correct. As quickly as he could, Sulla had marched 2 legions to their relief, and upon seeing this new force, the Pompeians retreated. According to Caesar, every man of this unit suffered some kind of injury. The other 2 attacks had also been repelled, one by 3 cohorts and another by Caesar's German auxiliaries, who sallied out taking heavy losses in total. Caesar claims that the Pompeians lost 2,000 men and the Caesarians just 20. Though his own losses were surely much higher, it is likely that the citizens of Dyrrhachium were Pompey's agents who had lured Caesar into a trap. Pompey was proving a worthy and cunning enemy, but Caesar's veterans had proved their mettle, bolstered by the confidence of their victories. Caesar marched his army out in battle formation to offer battle to Pompey as a sign of strength. Pompey also drew his army up for battle, so as not to lose face but refused to engage. He would need to orchestrate a situation where he could use his overwhelming numbers in order to contend with Caesar's veterans. Meanwhile, Longinus and Sabinus had been successful in taking Aetolia, and had taken all the towns between Epirus and Corinth. They now planned to push past the Isthmus of Corinth and into the Peloponnese, but found their path blocked by a Pompeian force. Nonetheless, their success was crucial in giving Caesar an abundance of supplies from these new Greek territories. With more successes under his belt, Caesar again sent a peace delegation, this time to Scipio, hoping to convince the latter to talk to Pompey. But even though Scipio at first listened with interest, his officers were having none of it. At Dyrrhachium, Caesar fortified the two approaches to the town, cutting the Pompeian cavalry in the area off from the supplies there, with the cavalry now unable to sustain themselves. Pompey withdrew them by sea back to his entrenchments, but Pompey's food was still running low, and he knew he would have to soon force a breakout. To try to achieve this, Pompey's men occupied the original fortifications of the 9th, which were between the two armies' fortifications, and expanded on them, making a second larger camp that encompassed the first. He also added a long wall from the camp to a nearby river to secure a water supply. This would act as a forward base from where Pompey could strike. Pompey suddenly had a stroke of luck when two Gallic officers who served Caesar during the Gallic Wars deserted. They had detailed intel about Caesar's defenses and knew where the weak points were, and they now passed all this information to Pompey. At the southern end of Caesar's defenses, where the fortifications met the coast, Caesar's 9th Legion was stationed under Marcellinus, after having been forced to withdraw from their original camp. They had constructed a second camp and fortifications that stretched to the coast. Behind this, they had constructed a second line of defenses facing south, preventing Pompey from landing troops behind and attacking their rear. To complete the defenses, an extra line of defenses would need to be made between the two walls, linking them together and blocking any attack from the sea. But these defenses were incomplete. Pompey formulated his plan. He would attack the inner wall with his legions, landing light infantry and missile troops to the south to attack the outer wall, while even more troops would be landed between the two walls. In doing so, he would attack the 9th from 3 sides. This took a lot of careful planning and timing. And he withdrew his legions from the 9th's old fort and behind his own lines to coordinate. After a couple of days of preparation, he was ready. He moved 60 cohorts of legionaries around, 30,000 men to attack Caesar's inner fortifications, while the light infantry was moved by boat behind the outer wall. As they began their attack, more men were simultaneously landed at the gap between the entrenchments. There were only 2 cohorts of the 9th present at the time, the rest still being in camp. These 1,000 men now found themselves under furious attack from 3 sides by overwhelming numbers. Desperately, they tried to form a line and sent word to Marcellinus for help. But the numbers were too much, and the men broke and ran. As they did, they ran into the reinforcing cohorts sent by Marcellinus, causing chaos in the narrow gap between the walls. The Pompeians closed in on Marcellinus's camp, which was now only defended by a couple of cohorts. Luckily, Antony, who was close at hand, managed to organize 6,000 men and came to their aid. Stopping the Pompeian advance, he was soon joined by Caesar, alerted by smoke signals, and another 6,500 men. Both forces now had most of their men committed to this part of the line, while Pompey's main force had been pushing on to the 9th's camp. More men had already begun construction of a fort outside of Caesar's fortifications to the south. The blockade had been broken. Caesar ordered his men to begin construction of a trench, plugging the gap between the 2 walls. While this was being done, Caesar's scouts spotted a Pompeian legion moving back into the 9th Legion's old fort. If Pompey took this fort, he would be able to make a link between his new fort in the south and his old fortifications. Caesar was determined to stop this from happening. Gathering around 17,000 men and leaving 1,000 to continue entrenching, Caesar took a circuitous route, concealing his force as long as possible, and then launched the attack. His left wing, where Caesar himself was pushed into the fort, forcing the Pompeian legion back into the inner camp, Caesar's right wing, however, had stumbled across the Pompeian entrenchments that led to the river. Thinking these were part of the fort, they followed them looking for a gate through. When they reached the river and realized their mistake, they managed to break down points in the defenses, breaking through followed by the cavalry, but they had wasted precious time. Pompey had seen what was happening and sent all his heavy infantry, 25,000 men, to assist the legion in the fort. The cavalry rode ahead of the legions and fell upon the Caesarian cavalry of the right flank, routing them almost instantly. The infantry around them, seeing their comrades fleeing, and Pompey's men closing in, also ran. The narrow passages they had made through the entrenchments became clogged, and some men took to jumping from the ramparts into the ditches to try to escape. Many were trampled to death inside the fort itself. Pompey's legion was fighting back. With renewed courage, Caesar's left, afraid that they were about to be trapped inside the narrow confines of the fort, also began to break, retreating through the gate. Caesar tried to stop the rout, grabbing onto fleeing standard-bearers and ordering them to stand their ground. One, overcome by panic, even tried to stab Caesar, but he was saved by his bodyguards. Caesar's entire force that had been committed to the attack had retreated broken. But Pompey, fearing Caesar had laid a trap, did not pursue, and the narrow breaches in the defenses stopped his cavalry from pursuing further. If he had, he may well have been able to destroy Caesar's army. In total, Caesar gives his dead as being 32 officers, centurions and tribunes, almost 1,000 legionaries, and 200 horsemen. He had also lost many men as prisoners, perhaps as many as 1,000. On the orders of Labienus, all of these men were killed. Pompey was hailed as imperator, but as a sign of respect, refused the symbolic bay leaves that went with the title, due to his victory being over fellow Roman Caesar, after having committed almost 3 months to the battle, pulled away his full force from Dyrrhachium defeated. The Pompeians took this as a full retreat, and word was sent to eastern kings that the war was already won. However, Pompey had failed to strike a killing blow. He had done well to break out of Caesar's encirclement, but had missed the opportunity to use his overwhelming numbers. Caesar was a dangerous enemy who could not be left any space to regroup. Nonetheless, Caesar was able to carry out an ordered withdrawal of his army with only light harassment from Pompey's forces, pulling back to Apollonia. As he did so, he comforted his men, saying that just as Gergovia had preceded Alesia, so too would this defeat at Dyrrhachium be followed by a far greater victory. Still, Caesar was in a precarious position. The army under his command was by now heavily depleted, and his other legions were scattered around Greece, 2 under Domitius Calvinus around Macedonia, and 1 in southern Greece under Longinus and Sabinus. Caesar's defeat also meant that his supporters would be wavering. He needed a victory soon, and it would need to be decisive. Caesar's priority was to get his army back into fighting condition, so he first marched to Apollonia, where he left his wounded, and sent 7 cohorts to garrison various towns and cities under his control. Longinus's legion would be safe in southern Greece, but Domitius and his 2 veteran legions of Gallic campaigns, who had been stalling and pinning Scipio Metellus during Dyrrhachium, were now exposed. All of Caesar's plans now revolved around merging his depleted army with Domitius. If Pompey marched on Italy, Caesar would meet up with Domitius and march through Illyria to attack Pompey from the rear. If Pompey marched on Caesar, Caesar would march to Domitius and fight a battle with the merged army. If Pompey besieged Caesar's allied towns in Greece, Caesar would march to Domitius and attack Scipio, forcing Pompey to react or lose an ally before any of these plans could be put into effect. Though Caesar had to get to Domitius, he began his march at full pace from Apollonia. Pompey, however, had also come to a similar conclusion. If Scipio was caught unsupported, his legions would surely be lost. Both Caesar and Pompey were once again in a race with each other, each hoping to reach their ally before the other. Leaving Cato in control of Dyrrhachium, Pompey began his march to Scipio. As he did, he took measures to slow Caesar, spreading the word of his defeat at Dyrrhachium. And as a result, Caesar found little support on his march, and his scouts and messengers found it impossible to reach Domitius, when both armies were just 4 hours from the positions of Domitius and Scipio. Caesar had a stroke of luck. Some of the Gauls who had defected to Pompey at Dyrrhachium had yet another change of heart, racing to Domitius and warning him of Pompey's approach and Caesar's location. Armed with this knowledge, Domitius was able to safely reposition and merge with Caesar. Caesar's whole army in the region, aside from the 27th, was now united. Nonetheless, Pompey still held the upper hand. He had more local support and supplies, and so his intention was now to avoid another confrontation with Caesar. Despite his numbers, he was still aware of both how much more experienced the enemy forces were compared to many of his own, and how dangerous Caesar was in the field. In Plutarch's words, Caesar and that army, who had stormed 1,000 cities, subdued over 3,000 nations, gained numberless battles of the Germans and Gauls, taken 1,000,000 prisoners, and killed as many in the field. Pompey was confident that in time Caesar would run out of supplies and that his army would break down. This was known as the Fabian strategy and had been used to great effect by Fabius Maximus against Hannibal in the Second Punic War. Many high-ranking members of Pompey's army, however, were pushing for a decisive battle. Ahenobarbus Scipio, Afranius, and Cicero applied pressure to Pompey, accusing the general variously of cowardice and even of having been bribed. Pompey would have to act soon, risk his army fracturing. Caesar, on the other hand, had wasted no time. He marched quickly to Gonfi, an important town with many supplies and home to the praetor of Thessaly, Androsthenes. Androsthenes had previously promised his and Thessaly's support for Caesar, but, following Dyrrhachium, had defected to Pompey, closing the gates of the city to Caesar. Caesar did not have the supplies or time to conduct a prolonged siege, so he decided to storm the town. The attack started at 3 in the afternoon and was all over by sunset. A number of nobles, likely including Androsthenes, committed suicide. Despite their defeat at Dyrrhachium, Caesar's veterans were still a force to be reckoned with. After resupplying, Caesar marched to Metropolis, which surrendered upon hearing the fate of Gonfi. Many other towns soon followed suit, and Caesar soon had enough local support to resupply his army for the time being. Pompey knew that if he could keep Caesar pinned in Thessaly, he would still eventually run out of supplies and be starved out, but the pressure from his officers was continually mounting. Finally, Pompey relented to their demands and marched his army to Pharsalus to give battle. Setting up his camp on the high ground, morale among Pompey's men was high, and his officers were confident of victory. They had a huge numerical advantage, and had already defeated Caesar once. Already, talks were being had about who would be the consuls and praetors after the war, who would get the property of Caesar and his allies, and who would hold Caesar's position of Pontifex Maximus after his defeat. According to Caesar, they were not concerned with the means by which they could gain the upper hand, but with the way in which they ought to use their victory. Their confidence was not unfounded. Pompey's army numbered around 47,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar's army, on the other hand, now numbered only around 21,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. According to his own account, it is likely that Caesar underplayed his numbers, and Appian suggests he had nearer 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. As Caesar failed to add his auxiliaries to his total, Caesar was equally confident. No, his army was not as numerous, but it was more experienced and disciplined. Only a handful of Pompey's legions were true veterans, most having been recruited specifically for the war, and only having seen their first action at Dyrrhachium. Furthermore, while the bulk of Pompey's infantry were Roman legions, they were supported by auxiliaries and allies from the east, making up the majority of light infantry and cavalry. These men, though all skilled warriors, would not have been trained to fight in the Roman style, and the multitude of languages spoken in Pompey's army would have made coordination difficult. The men Caesar had under his command were from his 10 veteran legions, all of whom had fought with him since his Gallic campaigns, some for as many as 12 years. Every day, Caesar would march his army out of the camp to the base of Pompey's hill, offering battle. Pompey each time refused to commit, pulling his men out of camp, but never moving from the high ground. It is clear that he was still not wholly committed to a pitched battle, and did not want to give up his advantageous position, only being willing to commit to minor skirmishes. While these maneuvers were going on, Caesar also mounted some of his infantry, drilling them each day to increase his cavalry to 2,000. It was still much less than Pompey's, but enough to at least stall them. It had been almost a month now since the Battle of Dyrrhachium, and Caesar eventually decided that if Pompey would not give battle, his best strategy would be to keep his army on the march, moving camp every day, forcing Pompey to shadow him and wearing out Pompey's less disciplined force. On the 9th of August 48 BC, Caesar was about to put this plan into action and had his army prepared to decamp when Pompey's army suddenly moved off from their position on the hill to the plains to give battle. It is not entirely clear why Pompey chose to do this. The most likely answer is that he was pressured by his supporters, who upon seeing Caesar ready to move, were worried Caesar would slip away, and had pressed Pompey to seize the opportunity and give battle. Whatever the reason, Caesar took it as a blessing, and also prepared his army for a battle on now even terrain. Pompey knew that his key advantages were his cavalry and his numbers, and he drew up his army to best maximize their effectiveness. His infantry was formed into the classic Roman triplex aces, but slightly deeper than the usual 10 men, depth ordered to better hold a defensive line. On his left wing, he stationed 2 legions under the command of Lucius Lentulus. These were 2 of Pompey's most experienced legions, one raised by himself, and the other having been raised by Caesar for the Gallic Wars, and later handed to Pompey. Just before the civil war, in his center, he stationed Scipio and his Syrian legions, while the right would be held by 2 legions combined into one, with a river to their right, protecting their flank. Within this twin legion were veterans from Cilicia and from Spain, likely survivors from the Battle of Ilerda. They were commanded by Ahenobarbus, one of Caesar's most active opponents. All these legions were Pompey's best men. They would take the brunt of the attack, while Pompey's less experienced legions, allies, and auxiliaries would form the 2 back lines. On Pompey's extreme left were his 7,000 cavalry, under the command of Labienus, supported by Pompey's skirmishers and archers. A further 2,000 infantry were held in reserve in Pompey's camp under the command of Afranius and Pompey's son, Gnaeus. Pompey positioned himself on the left. His plan was to use the tactic of his hero, Alexander the Great, with Ahenobarbus and the river guarding his right flank. Pompey's infantry would hold the line, while the entire cavalry force would flank left, destroying Caesar's cavalry before falling on his legions from behind, becoming the hammer to the anvil of the defending legions. Caesar also drew his army up in the triplex aces formation. The 10th Legion, Caesar's personal favorite, and some of his best troops were stationed on his right opposite Pompey. These men were commanded by Sylla, who had distinguished himself at Dyrrhachium, and this was also where Caesar positioned himself. On the left, Caesar positioned 2 of his other most experienced legions, the 8th and 9th, with the river to their left. These 2 legions had suffered so many casualties over recent campaigns that they were ordered to work as one legion under the command of Antony. The center would be held by the 11th and 12th under the command of Domitius. Caesar's remaining legions filled the 2nd and 3rd lines, the 3rd having strict orders not to engage until Caesar gave the signal. In order to match Pompey's line, Caesar had to stretch his own thin, only 6 men deep, Caesar's cavalry was stationed opposite Pompey's. They were hopelessly outnumbered, and Caesar was well aware that they would not be able to stall Pompey's horse for long. As such, he also pulled 3,000 men from various legions, arming them with spears, forming them into a fourth line. Caesar was the one to begin the engagement. Ordering his front two lines to charge Pompey's, Caesar's men expected Pompey's infantry to countercharge, as was standard military custom, but they instead stood fast, holding their line. In a brilliant display of discipline, Caesar's men spontaneously halted mid-charge and reassembled after a brief pause to regain their stamina. They moved slowly forward, only breaking into a charge once again when nearer to Pompey's line. Javelins were hurled from both sides, and Pompey's men, braced and with interlocked shields, held the line. An intense melee ensued with brutal close-quarters fighting. Pompey now put his plan into action. Labienus led the Pompeian cavalry to Caesar's right flank, supported by the skirmishers and archers. Smashing into the Caesarian cavalry, Caesar's men could not hold off the onslaught for long. Gradually being forced back before retreating entirely, they had, however, performed their role. While Pompey's cavalry had been fighting with Caesar's, Caesar had given the order for his fourth line of spear-armed infantry to wheel around to face Labienus and his cavalry. The Pompeian cavalry had been preparing to charge Caesar's legions in the rear, but with Caesar's cavalry acting as a screen, they hadn't seen Caesar's fourth line move into position, and they now found themselves being attacked by 3,000 heavily armored spearmen. Pompey's cavalry, though numerous, were not heavy cavalry, and many were young nobles with little experience of warfare. Fighting veteran spearmen head-on was not something they were cut out for. They were routed quickly, being forced to retreat to distant high ground to try to regroup, but the damage had already been done. Caesar's fourth line pushed on into Pompey's missile troops, easily crushing them. As they pushed on, it was now Pompey who was being flanked, his left flank legions, both of which had previously fought alongside Caesar, and his legions now found themselves attacked on multiple fronts by their old comrades. The 10th Legion from the front, and the 4th line from the left flank and rear. It was at this point that Caesar committed his third line of fresh troops, throwing every man he had into the battle. Under this huge pressure, Pompey's line began to break, starting with the 1st and 3rd. This was also where Pompey had stationed himself, and almost becoming surrounded. He had little choice but to flee the battlefield and retreat to his camp. The rest of Pompey's line broke in quick succession, Caesar's fourth line rolling up the flank, while his fresh third line pushed from the front. Some attempted to follow their general and retreat to their camp. Others simply fled the battlefield. Caesar, knowing his victory needed to be complete, stormed the camp, easily overwhelming the few thousand reserves and men who had retreated. Those that had retreated from the battlefield were soon surrounded on a hill and forced to surrender. Caesar had won. By the time Caesar stormed the camp, however, Pompey had already gone, fleeing with 30 bodyguards. Many other high-ranking Pompeians such as Labienus, Afranius, Scipio, and Pompey's son Gnaeus had also managed to escape. Nonetheless, not all had been so lucky. Ahenobarbus, brave but ill-starred, had been cut down in the retreat, possibly by Antony himself. Many others had been captured in Pompey's camp and in the immediate aftermath. Among these was a young man, Marcus Junius Brutus, the son of Caesar's mistress. Brutus was held in high regard by Caesar, who had given his men orders not to kill Brutus. When Brutus surrendered, Caesar was overjoyed. Welcoming him with open arms, Caesar showed his customary leniency to Pompey's soldiers as well, with more than 24,000 surrendering to him. In total, Caesar claims to have lost only 200 men and 30 centurions in the battle, while giving the Pompeian losses as 15,000 dead and 24,000 surrendered. These numbers seemed suspiciously exaggerated, and Appian suggests it was more likely 1,200 of Caesar's men dead and 6,000 of Pompey's, the rest surrendering or fleeing. Whichever is closer to the truth, the fact remains that Caesar's victory was decisive. Aside from having broken Pompey's largest army, he had scattered the Pompeian officers, many fleeing to North Africa, and absorbed many of Pompey's surrendered men into his army. Almost doubling its size, Pompey himself sailed first to the Greek islands of Lesbos and Mytilene. Meeting his wife Cornelia and his youngest son Sextus, his intent was to get his family far away from Caesar and use his connections in the east to rebuild an army to resist Caesar. By the time he reached Cyprus, he had taken out private loans and put together a fleet along with 2,000 men. His defeat, however, had cost him much public support. Pompey had initially planned to head to the province of Syria, but they turned against him, and he was forced to look elsewhere. He decided on Egypt. The boy pharaoh Ptolemy XIII owed his throne to Pompey. Pompey had supported Ptolemy's father and guaranteed his will that made Ptolemy pharaoh. Pompey had also lent a number of officers and soldiers from his eastern command to the pharaoh's army. Confident he would find support there, Pompey sailed to Egypt. He was met off the coast by a small rowing boat that would take Pompey to shore. Aboard were a man called Savius, the head of the Egyptian army at Chilos, and an ex-officer of Pompey's, Lucius Septimius. Pompey's wife was worried about this lack of pomp and suspected something was not right. But Pompey was reassured by the presence of Septimius. Stepping off his ship, he quoted a line of Sophocles to his wife: "He who enters a tyrant's door becomes his slave, even if he leaves a free man." As the small boat rowed to shore, Pompey tried to alleviate the tense atmosphere, telling Septimius he was an old comrade. He received only a nod of recognition in response. Septimius then struck, stabbing the old general, quickly followed by both Achillas and Savius. Septimius then beheaded his corpse, throwing the body naked into the sea. Ptolemy, upon the council of his advisors, had betrayed Pompey in order to try to win approval from Caesar. Pompey the Great, 3 times consul, conqueror of the East, and one of the Roman Republic's most prolific generals, was dead. It is worth noting how revered Pompey was. Plutarch despaired that he and Caesar had gone to war. Had they been willing to enjoy the fruits of their labors in peace and tranquility, the greatest and best part of the world was their own, if they must have victories and triumphs. What Scythian horse, what Parthian arrows, what Indian treasures could have resisted 70,000 Romans, led on by Pompey and Caesar? Though arguably past his prime at Pharsalus, Pompey had not at all fought badly. His plan was solid and the best that could be done. The reason for his defeat was not poor generalship, but the skill and experience of Caesar and his infantry, and the lack of experience of Pompey's cavalry. Pompey and Caesar were both incredibly talented generals, and it is telling how often the two decided on similar strategies. When Caesar reached Egypt, having pursued Pompey, he was first presented with Pompey's head. Disgusted, he turned away. He was next presented the seal of Pompey, at which point Caesar broke down in tears, though enemies in later life. It is worth remembering that Caesar and Pompey had been political allies for around 8 years, had effectively ruled Rome together, and had even been related by marriage. Caesar was well aware that, despite being his enemy, Pompey had been a titan of his time, worthy of his respect. Caesar's victory marked a turning point in the war. It was now the Optimates who would find themselves on the back foot. Nevertheless, the war was far from over. Pompey's staunchest supporters, Cato, Scipio, and Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus, had all fled to North Africa to continue the resistance. With them also was Labienus, now undoubtedly the best commander among the Optimates. The war against Pompey was done, but the civil war was still ongoing, and there were external enemies daring to challenge Caesar. In our next video, we will talk about Caesar's battles, military and political, that took place after the death of Pompey. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button in order to be notified. These long episodes are very difficult to make, So consider supporting us by commenting, liking, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.